Bonjour à tous, nous sommes le jeudi 25 avril 2024 et je suis ravi de vous retrouver pour ce nouveau numéro du Conseil scientifique indépendant. Je suis le docteur Louis Fouché, médecin anesthésiste réanimateur et en même temps Master 2 en éthique de la santé et en anthropologie de la santé. Je n'ai aucun outil et j'ai 0 € enregistrés sur la base Transparence Santé ainsi que la base Eurofodox européenne quant au conflit d'intérêts avec l'industrie pharmaceutique. Et vous savez que le Conseil scientifique indépendant est une agora de chercheurs, de médecins, d'universitaires et de citoyens qui permet de déposer une parole scientifique pour que vous, citoyens, soyez informés de manière claire, loyale et appropriée pour prendre une décision ou donner un consentement ou non de manière libre et éclairée à des décisions sanitaires ou à des décisions médicales qui vous concernent. Cette parole libre et vive, exemple de conflit d'intérêts depuis maintenant plus de 2 ans et demi, ce qui est une gageure. Aujourd'hui, j'ai la chance de recevoir un acteur particulièrement important de sur la question du Covid, mais au-delà de la question de la science, des médias et l'ensemble de la production du savoir, une question épistémologique. C'est le docteur Pierre Kory que je reçois aujourd'hui. Hello, Dr. Pierre Kory, how are you doing?
Louis, très bien, merci.
Thank you very much for being here today. I'm happy to have you. You are with the Independent Scientific Council today. Can you introduce yourself a little bit for the people in France who would not know you?
Sure. So I am I'm a lung specialist, an intensive care unit specialist, and an internist. With Paul Marek, my colleague, we founded an organization in COVID called the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, or FLCCC, where we we simply sought to develop protocols to treat really all phases of the disease, prevention, treatment, and of course, long COVID, or what I call long vax, because it's sort of the same disease. We treat a lot of vaccine injured. And so we've become sort of experts on the clinical treatment of COVID, and we've tried to share that knowledge with the world.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And it's very useful for the French doctors and also for French patients who can see what you produce on the website. And I will give the reference. It's FLCCC, and I will share it with you just after. And it will be under the description. So you can find the different protocols about prevention, early treatment, late treatment, and also treatment of the recovery after COVID, but also after vaccine injury. And so that's a real big work that you did, and especially around one molecule, which is called ivermectin. Can you tell us why you're such a specialist of this molecule?
Well, you know, we first started developing a treatment protocol for the hospital phase of the disease in March of 2020. Paul Marek started one, and then we got to get a group, and we did that. And we were following all the therapeutics. We were following all the possible treatments like hydroxychloroquine, a whole bunch of others that were thought to be effective. And we always had a question mark around ivermectin, but around October of 2020, we felt, Paul Marek noticed there was a few trials that came out, and one of them was in a prominent journal in our country called Chest, and it was about severely ill hospital patients with a 70% reduction in mortality. And so we started to be persuaded by the clinical data. It was just so overwhelmingly positive that I began writing a review paper, and I literally spent 4 to 6 weeks doing nothing but reading about ivermectin. And it was a really hard paper to write because every time I was nearly finished, a new trial would come out. So then I'd have to put the new trial in, change the references, and my reference manager wasn't working. But I dug really deep and discovered amazing things about ivermectin, that it's a really broad antiviral, and it's literally one of the most effective treatments for COVID. And so I became kind of a clinical expert in the drug.
Can you read me, Pierre?
Yes, I think you checked out for a second.
Yeah, sorry, I lost you for a few seconds.
Yeah, Louis, I think
you were dealing with.
Hold on, I think your internet. I don't think it's mine. I think it's yours. Like a couple of times you've like paused and like your voice gets weird for a second.
Is it kind of better now? Because
now it's fine. It happens every once in a while. Right now, it's fine.
Not so sure. Okay. Don't know why I have such a bad internet now, just at the right moment. Is it all right doing like that, or shall we do it again?
No, I think it's fine. I mean, you'll have to edit it afterwards, but it's fine.
I think it's going to be better.
Okay.
How is it?
Yeah, it's good now.
Do you want to we start all over again?
No, I mean, do you want to do that, or can you just edit that part out?
No, I'm going to cut a little bit. That's all right. Let's go with it.
I mean, it was fine until I finished my answer. Then it's just that you disappeared. As long as you cut that out, that's fine.
Yeah, good for me. So you also wrote a book about the what you call ivermectin war. Why is it such a war?
Yeah. So when we came out and we had ivermectin on our protocol, I was invited to speak in our United States Senate for a hearing on early treatments of COVID. And I presented all the data supporting ivermectin, and I sort of made a public call that it be, widely used in the prevention and treatment of COVID. And, Louis, I thought that after that testimony, I didn't think they would have a parade for us, but I thought they would be appreciative, meaning the public. That there was finally a treatment that we'd identified for early treatment. Because remember, hydroxychloroquine, which you guys were using, was so maligned and so attacked that I thought this would be a solution. The challenge is that after that testimony, our lives all went sideways. I mean, the short story is literally our careers ended for bringing forth that science. We were so attacked. I started getting attacked in the media. Our papers started getting retracted that I passed peer review. We were getting censored everywhere. My organization, even PayPal, where we were getting donations, they cut us off. I mean, such strange things were happening to us. And I realized that it was a war, not on ivermectin, not just on ivermectin, but really on all cheap, repurposed, off-patent drugs. And listen, you fought the war on hydroxychloroquine. It was the same war, same results. And one of my colleagues could have written a book, The War on Hydroxychloroquine. But I used ivermectin as a case study of what's called a disinformation campaign. And there's an article called The Disinformation Playbook. It was written in 2017, and it outlines all the tactics that industries and corporations use when science emerges that's inconvenient to their interests. And never has more inconvenient science emerged than, for instance, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, because those drugs and their efficacy threatened the profits of the entire global vaccine campaign: Paxlovid, Molnupiravir, Remdesivir, monoclonal antibodies. And so the pharmaceutical industry is the most skilled and the most powerful practitioner of disinformation campaigns. And I outline in my book all of the tactics they use, because I had a front row seat to it, Louis. I mean, I saw everything they were doing. Once I learned about disinformation from that article, which didn't occur until March of 2021. So, after my testimony, until I read that article, I couldn't understand what was happening in the world. I just didn't understand why we were getting attacked so much. And once I read that article, it was like light bulbs went off in my head, and I got to see the world in a very different way. And I made a commitment to document exactly what they were doing, because I want the public to know what they do and how they do it, really to create scientific lies. And they make scientific lies be the accepted standard. And as you know, with hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And so they're going to do this. They've been doing this for many years. They're going to keep doing it. In fact, disinformation, those tactics were actually developed by the tobacco industry in the 1950s. And so they've been doing this a long time, and they do it in all industries. It's not just the pharmaceutical industry. And so I think it's a really important book for people to read and understand.
So you are comparing what Robert Proctor did for the tobacco industry, trying to show how you are building the ignorance of the public purposingly, and with what happened with the COVID. For many people, it's kind of difficult to accept, because it would mean that our government or our healthcare policies or the institutionals are corrupted and part of this scenario. What can you answer them? Because were you genuine, just like this, the people that I described before, this story of ivermectin, or did you had already kind of a warning in the head about the pharmaceutical industry and our institutions?
No, not at all. I mean, I knew that big pharma was bad and they did things that helped their bottom line and to make profits. But I thought it was like in America, we have these drug representatives who come into the doctor's offices and the hospitals and they try to market the drugs or treatments. I thought it was around that they would just, heavily, they give payments to doctors, they'll go on trips and dinners. Like, I thought it was just kind of soft corruption. When COVID started, I literally thought Anthony Fauci was a sympathetic guy in a tough position, with a lot of critics, doing the best he could. I mean, I had a trust in our officials and our agencies, especially our medical journals. I literally venerated those journals. I thought the best scientists were published there. And, your question is really good, because I mean, I'm so used to it now, but I agree. I think the larger public that might be listening to me, they can't believe the scope and the scale of the corruption that I had to discover. And the only reason why I discovered it is because I became expert on a certain medicine. And once I was expert, I could point out all the lies and who said the lies, how they said the lies, where they said the lies. And the answers are just astonishing. I mean, it comes from the highest impact medical journals who published brazenly fraudulent trials on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. They did it with regularity. And each big trial that they conducted, which were fraudulently designed, were designed to reach a conclusion, a predetermined conclusion, that ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine didn't work. And you saw that happening over and over again. And all of the positive trials were published in third-tier journals, and media never covered them. And so you saw this unfortunate collaboration between the journals, the media, and the agencies. And listen, there is immense amounts of evidence to show that those three entities are literally run by the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, they get the last word in what gets published, what gets said, what gets promoted. I mean, if you look at the drugs that were used in COVID in the United States of America, every single one was patented and in the hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And we have data on 43 different effective medicines for COVID. Many of them are $1, $5, $10. None of them were ever recommended or supported or studied in terms of government research. And so the corruption now that I see it's almost incomprehensible to see how bad science has been corrupted.
So this scenario of bad science and fraudulent science to support new medications would be part of kind of a planified obsolescence of the old molecule and impossibility of using them again, right?
For sure. I mean, that is what we call the Achilles heel of the pharmaceutical industry, is off-patent medicines. That industry is used to making obscene profits on new molecules that are under patent. As soon as one comes off of patent, they have to attack the old ones to promote the new ones and make the new ones standard of care. So they have a difficult job, because we have thousands of approved, safe, off-patent medicines, many of which have numerous mechanisms that you can use for different diseases. And, they can't have that. It hurts their business model. And so that industry is also, unfortunately, a documented criminal industry. They behave like a criminal syndicate. They've been convicted of behaving like a criminal syndicate, of doing numerous crimes, paying fines in the many, many billions of dollars. And so they operate with impunity, and they're very, very good at what they do. I mean, if you look at the example of ivermectin, I mean, they were able to convince the majority of the world that it's a dangerous and ineffective drug, while it's one of the safest and most effective drugs. I mean, they can turn a truth into a lie like nobody's business.
could you inform us with several techniques that they can use to make an SF fraudulent or a trial would fail about that?
For sure. For sure. So I think of the 5 tactics. So the disinformation playbook, there's 5 tactics that are mentioned, that's defined in there. And they're all given the name of an American football play. It's like the fake, the fix, the blitz, the screen. But the most powerful tactic is something called the fake. And that's where they design trials with predetermined results. They're very good at this. And so you'll see these trials done at the highest universities, the largest trials. The rest of science and the media call it the large, high quality, rigorous trials, right? So for instance, the trial done at Oxford, or the one done by the National Institutes of Health here in America. But when you look at those trials, they have the same features. So I have a chapter in my book called The Big Six, because it was literally 7 trials now that they used to convince the world that ivermectin didn't work. And each trial had the same design, which is they gave as low a dose as possible, as late into the disease as possible, for as short a duration as possible, and they also chose the mildest patients, and they studied like hospitalization and death, right? So if you do that, it's almost impossible to show effects, especially the mild patient one. They were very good at enrolling mild patients late into the disease. And so there are very simple maneuvers that you can do to make something look ineffective. Now, what's so fascinating about that, Lewis, and I think you know this, is despite doing those things, they still couldn't suppress the evidence of efficacy of ivermectin. And they literally had to resort to manipulating the data, inventing new statistics, ignoring their statistical plan in order to claim that it didn't work. I mean, the fraud was so brazen. Anyone who's paying attention, who knows how clinical trials are done, but the fact that it was allowed and published in the highest impact journals, to me, was a life-changing moment. I couldn't believe these are the best journals in the world, and they're letting these very highly pedigreed and expert researchers pull these statistical tricks in order to bury evidence of efficacy. And that was a really shocking finding. So that's just one of them, the fake. But they did that over and over. And what was really disappointing is each time one of those trials was published in the highest impact journals, it created like a PR campaign. You saw newspapers blaring all over the country and the world, latest high quality, rigorous study of ivermectin finds it is ineffective, and then there'd always be comments about like the ivermectin advocates and how we're proven wrong. We were made to look silly and foolish, and then people would attack me all over social media and in public that I didn't know what I was doing, that I don't know, how to doctor or how to read research or science. I mean, absolutely absurd, absolutely absurd.
But despite all this production of fraudulent trials and fake information and disinformation, the evidence is massive about the effectiveness and the safety of these molecules. Could you cite us a few research that have been done about that and proving? And is there some place where the people could find the results of the overall science or reviews that could be trustworthy?
Lewis, I believe you asked me about some examples of fraudulent science. Your voice came in very, very choppy. I think the best, I mean, obviously I best compiled it in my book. But I would say, I also have a blog, which is called Pierre Kory medicalmusings.com. And I go into great detail on a number of the trials. So for instance, the trial out of Brazil called the Together trial. Recently, I did a post on Oxford's Principle trial, which was actually the most brazen of them all in terms of manipulating the data. And what's really crazy with the Principle trial out of Oxford is they did something which has occurred in science before, but it's quite rare. But they have to resort to doing this. But the Principle trial was a profoundly positive trial. All of the data, if you look at the data in the paper, it's profoundly positive, statistically significant, yet it was written up as a negative trial. And that's when they really have to push the envelope. So, and they also published it. What's interesting is The other, so I called it the chapter in my book called The Big Six. Those are the biggest trials, all fraudulent. The principal trial is really the seventh because it is a big trial. But unlike the other six, it was published in a very low tier journal. It was literally the seventh most popular infectious disease journal. Nobody reads infectious disease journals unless you're an infectious disease specialist. And certainly the seventh ranked one, it's like burying it in the woods. And which I find very odd for a group and an institution and a trial that was paid so much attention to. They buried this into a distant journal, and because what they did was so brazen that they had to do that. But yeah, I mean, I've summarized this. There's also a great Substack written by a colleague. It's called "Do Your Own Research" by Alexandros Marinos, and I would call him the world expert on ivermectin trials and COVID. He's an obsessive, really smart guy, knows his statistics and his math. And what he published on these trials was astounding. I mean, he looked at all the protocol revisions and how they pulled tricks. Like they were literally changing these trials in the middle and making decisions, just trying to bury the evidence of efficacy of ivermectin. And he did it like nobody else.
So there is the pharma founding fake science and fraudulent science, and then you have the addition industry who is propelling this fake science, and then you have a kind of a resonance, a Streisand effect done by the media, right? Meaning that a small study in a unknown review can turn to be well known by everybody because it's on every news all the time. So what's the role of the media in that, of the general media?
Louis, I think I understood what you said, but I very little came across. I think you were asking about
the
maybe
role of
media,
the media
or something.
Yeah.
I mean, well, here's the thing. The United States, I think it's almost 20 years ago, they passed a law allowing the pharmaceutical industry to advertise their products on television. The only country in the world except for New Zealand that allows that legally. And once they did that, the biggest advertiser on our media. And so if you're talking about television, newspapers, everything, the pharmaceutical dollar is, you've seen over the last 20 years that they used to have shows where, a journalist would interview someone who'd been injured by a pharmaceutical product, or they would talk about some of these frauds that have occurred in history. But now you don't see that. I mean, the money is coming from the pharmaceutical industry, which literally pays the salaries of all these media people. That's only one influence. I also think there's a military influence, and we also know that much of our media is unfortunately infiltrated by our intelligence agencies, and so they can also direct what's being said on television. But the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, you can't do a report on the dangers of the vaccines or on how great ivermectin is and expect for that advertising dollar to keep coming. I mean, it's pretty straightforward how that influence is exerted.
Okay, so we dealt with the fact that there was a production of disinformation, but we could wait from the institution, just like the FDA, to rule out that, to be able to see the good part and the bad part, and to make a right decision for the doctors and the patient in the end. What did the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, did during this COVID about ivermectin?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up, right? Because so far we've kind of discussed, I talked about the trials, the journals, the media, and this was where the story gets even darker, is that our public health agencies participated, if in fact even helped lead this disinformation campaign. So you get to see the influence of the pharmaceutical industry everywhere. So for your viewers, Louis, in the United States, we have 3 public health agencies. One is what's called the CDC. They kind of do epidemiology, disease surveillance. One is the NIH, so National Institutes of Health, and they are really responsible for funding research in this country. They have a massive budget. I think they're like the largest research funder in the world. So much research is done here in the United States. And then the third is the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. And the FDA is the regulatory agencies. I think it's like your EMA in Europe. And they're responsible for regulating drugs and making sure that they're safe and effective. Now, this FDA settlement that came about recently, so my partner, Paul Marek, was a plaintiff on the case. He and two other colleagues and a law firm in DC. And the law firm that brought this case was headed by a former U.S. White House counsel. He was literally the lawyer for the president back in the 80s and 90s. He had a high-powered law firm, and he saw what the FDA was doing was illegal. And so he brought a case, and he needed plaintiffs. So he asked Paul and two other colleagues to be plaintiffs on the case, because he saw that the FDA was acting outside their authority. They're a regulatory agency, and they were literally attacking ivermectin on social media and on their website, trying to warn people and doctors away from using it. And that's called practicing medicine. And they were literally inserting themselves into the practice of medicine. So here's the thing, Lewis. Why would they do that? Why would this regulatory agency step outside their authority and start attacking one of the safe medicines in history? And I just want to say that in my book, I have a chapter which is called The Horse Dewormer PR Campaign. And what's really, and when I said this story gets dark, because let's talk about what the FDA did. So I detail in my book a very closely coordinated series of events which were perpetrated not just by the FDA. It was the FDA, the CDC, and the NIH. And it was in 10 days in August of 2021. And I believe that it was triggered by a report that came out in the middle of August, which showed ivermectin prescriptions in this country were getting up to 90,000 a week. And that's just retail pharmacy. So I think the pharmaceutical industry saw that ivermectin was starting to be used at very, very high rates. Patients and doctors were figuring out that it worked. And so I believe that's when they launched a very coordinated and synchronized PR campaign. Because if you look, on August 21st, 2021, the FDA put out a tweet. It's a very famous tweet. I'm sure you and your viewers know it, but it said, it showed a woman, pretty woman, stroking a horse. And then the tweet said, you are not a horse. You are not a cow. Stop it, y'all. And it's literally FDA putting out this snarky little tweet, telling the country, stop using ivermectin. Now, why does the FDA have to do that in such a way? Now, that tweet went viral, and I think it's important to know that, because that's not an accident. I believe they were working with very high-level public relations people. I mean, they can make a tweet like that go viral. It's the most popular tweet in the FDA's history. But let's go back to the timeline. August 21st, FDA sends out that tweet. 5 days later, the CDC sends a memo to every state licensing board, and it goes out to every licensed physician in the United States. And this memo basically warns doctors that there's a rise in calls to poison control centers. And a couple of investigative journalists looked into it, called the poison control centers. And the headline of this memo was completely sensationalized. It was, I think, an increase of 4 calls. And they said, calls are up 70% or something outrageous. So they're completely misrepresenting, because remember, propaganda is a story or a message that gets you to think or act in a certain way. And so they're sending out these coordinated messages, right? So ivermectin is only for horses. Don't use it, right? That's one message. The other one is ivermectin is dangerous. Don't use it. And then 3 days after that, so we talked about the FDA, they took a shot at ivermectin. Then the CDC takes a shot at ivermectin. And then 3 days later, Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health shows up on national television on CNN, and he tells the country literally these words. He says, don't do it. There's no clinical evidence that this works. And he says it twice. And so you see these agencies literally participating in a propaganda campaign to destroy or distort the evidence of efficacy. And the FDA, every time they talk about ivermectin, they remind the country that they have not approved or authorized it for COVID. Now, Lewis, you know this. That is essentially a lie. Well, or at least it's a gross misleading statement, because We don't need them to approve it for COVID. Any FDA-approved drug can be used off-label to treat any other disease. It's actually a practice that is championed by the FDA on their own website. They talk about the virtues and the benefits of off-label prescribing. And yet they keep hammering this message to everyone that we haven't approved it, we haven't authorized it. We don't need them to do it. No one's going to ask them to do it. There's no money in doing it. It's very expensive to get the FDA to get a new approval for a drug. And so you can see these brazen distortions and literally their participation in a propaganda campaign. And it works because, I'm going to stop here, Louis, but I want to go back to a point you made earlier, is that most people have an implicit faith and trust into their government, their institutions, and their agencies. I used to have that trust. After what I've seen them do, and by the way, these actions, let's be serious here, these actions that they took led to the deaths of millions of people around the world. A lot of people look to the United States because so much research is done here. They think we have some of the biggest research dollars and, you know, some of the best scientists, especially like in medicine, and they're propagating lies that go around the world. And so it's really quite a dark and depraved story.
Yeah. It enlightens the fact that those people are kind of criminals.
Yes.
They have no respect in any way for life and human life. And they have the power of doing and to inform the people and make them do as they want. That was my question. Did it work so well, or did people and doctors manage to go through those information and kept on prescribing ivermectin? You told us that ivermectin was rocketing after your intervention and after the global preoccupation for caring for this disease and trying something that was working and which was an evidence it was working, and it was rocketing up in this prescription. Did it stop with this campaign?
Oh yeah. So you bring up a couple of points. So number one, this campaign, it didn't convince everybody. I mean, the doctors who had started using it already, you could see clinically, just observationally, how well it worked. I mean, you know, I always talk about the first patient I treated. She was she had been sick for 2 weeks. She was one of those patients with acute COVID who 2 weeks in, still having fevers, still having high heart rates, felt like, you know, crap, really tired. And she took ivermectin on a Sunday night. She felt very flushed for like an hour later. She went to sleep, and in the morning she had no fever. Her heart rate was 80. Her heart rate before she took the ivermectin was like a resting heart rate of 120. That's how sick she was. And in the morning she felt completely like so much more well. I mean, that's just 12 hours later after one pill. And I saw that reproducibly in a lot of patients, mostly in the first wave and sometimes later. You know, the efficacy of ivermectin changed. It depended on the dose and the variant, but it was so easy to tell that it worked. So a lot of doctors knew it worked. I think there are some doctors who knew that it worked because they're used to the pharmaceutical industry and the agencies lying. I mean, I've met a lot of folks who've been doing this a long time and they know what the pharmaceutical industry does, but I would say the majority believe that it didn't work. But in the wake of that campaign, what happened was you really couldn't get pharmacists to fill at pharmacies. They were arrogant and indignant. You know, valid legal prescriptions for an off-label medicine were being refused by these pharmacists. You know, they were psychologically impaired from the propaganda, and they would literally cite the FDA. They say, the FDA says it's not approved for COVID. It's like, and you try to argue with the pharmacist, and they would get firmer and more resistant, and they wouldn't fill. And then worse than that, Louis, is that the hospitals started taking it out of their pharmacies. And so it wasn't even available to treat sick hospital patients. And so the power they have over the boards of pharmacy was immense. And you know, after the other thing that happened, so this is where, so I already outlined the FDA, what the CDC did, what the NIH did. At the same time, the day after the NIH, the American Medical Association, the American Boards of Pharmacy, and the American Hospital Pharmacy Association, 3 different professional societies, right, representing physicians and pharmacists, they put out a huge memo which said, we call for the immediate cessation in prescribing and dispensing ivermectin for the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. I literally said that word for it. So now you have 3 societies putting out this huge memo. Louis, it's like they were attacking OxyContin. I mean, this drug and the way they attacked it must have been the most dangerous drug, with people dropping dead in the streets everywhere, because it must have been a public health disaster. When you see how they behaved, it could only be explained if it was literally a deadly drug that was being disseminated through society. And we all know that that's not true. And so your viewers have to ask the question, why did they behave that way? And I think there's only one reason, is ivermectin was such a massive threat to everything they were doing. I mean, this was a war that they were playing, and ivermectin threatened everything, and they had to destroy it.
Yeah, I can testify about what you said just before, because I used to prescribe ivermectin in intensive care, and the pharmacists refused to give it and to provide it. So I went with the patient and the family to buy it to the corner pharmacy on the street, out from the hospital, with my own money. And so that's what I had to do. It was really crazy for me. I sent 50 papers to justify my position to the pharmacist, and he wouldn't read it. Nope. It would tell me, this is politic, all of that is politic, you're prescribing for politic reasons. And I was trying to show him there was kind of a paradox with the prescription of remdesivir, of Paxlovid and things like that, which has no proof, or gave renal insufficiency and things like that, and all the side effects, and were very expensive. But it didn't work. Just like if people were hypnotized and mesmerized by the different injunctions of the institutions.
And I mean, what you say is just spot on. I mean, it's just the world went mad, and the people in the world, they were behaving in a way that they thought was correct. You know, the way, because really the war on ivermectin and all of COVID, it really was propaganda and censorship. I mean, so the people were being presented certain information, and they were acting on that information because they thought it was true, and they believed where it was coming from. They believed the media, they believed the experts, the societies, the agencies. And so when you, Louis, and myself, when we had a different opinion, and I want to emphasize, like you did, a very well-studied opinion. I mean, we looked at the trials, we looked at the data. I mean, it was overwhelming when you actually looked yourself, but yet what was being said was the opposite. And yeah, I was told I couldn't use things. And, you know, there's another chapter in my book called A Legal Legend. So there's this lawyer here in the United States who, his name is Ralph Larigo. He's from Buffalo, New York. And he had a longtime client. He's a commercial litigator, like a business litigator, but he had a longtime client whose mother was in the hospital. And they gave the mother, the son found our website, the flccc.net, saw our protocol, took the information and all the studies to the doctor in the ICU and said, I want you to give my mother ivermectin. He gave the mother ivermectin, and she started to get better. I think she came off the ventilator the next day. She was transferred to a different ward, but the doctors there would not, and she started to get worse. The doctors would not give her ivermectin. So the son was so enraged, he got Ralph to sue the hospital to give her ivermectin. And I wrote, like, the expert witness, the affidavit, and he actually won that first case. They gave her ivermectin, and she was out of the hospital 6 days later. Over the next year, Ralph received 200 requests to sue hospitals, 200. 80 of them went to court. You'll not believe this data. 80 cases went to court. He literally won 40 cases and he lost 40 cases. In the 40 he won, 38 people survived. In the 40 he lost, 2 people survived. And if that's not evidence of efficacy, I don't know what is. But he won most of them early. Then he started losing them because the hospitals got wise to what he was doing. And boy, did they bring out the lawyers, and they fought tooth and nail to prevent severely critically ill and often dying patients from getting one of the world's safest medicines. That's how much the world went mad in COVID.
Yeah, I think it is one of the great preoccupation of nowadays, even after the COVID, is not to turn lunatic. Now we can see all around us, it's just like a cuckoo's nest. People grabbing information everywhere and trusting things that they shouldn't trust, but not trusting the everyday life and the real people just around us and the real specialists of different subjects, but trusting like TV doctors coming on TV shows which know nothing and are corrupted. And so part of it is about continuing to say the information, to speak out and to tell what's happening in the reality, to try and go through this lunatic moment of our humanity.
I agree. And you know, it makes me think back, Louis, you know, when we started the FLCCC, you know, I thought our credibility would give us a voice, you know, because Paul Marik, my partner and co-founder, I mean, he is the most published practicing ICU specialist in the history of the specialty. Most published practicing. And so, I mean, his impact in critical care is, you know, almost indescribable. In critical care, although I wasn't the level of Paul, I was very well known. I mean, I was one of the pioneers in critical care ultrasonography. My textbook is translated into 7 languages, second edition. Umberto Meduri is like the world expert on corticosteroids in critical illness. I mean, you know these names, Louis. You're an ICU specialist, a word like me. And I thought that the group of us, our credibility and our impacts and our successful academic careers would make a difference, but it didn't. We got attacked and we got ridiculed as, you know, fringe and radical, and just anti-vaxxers came up really quickly, you know, because we were promoting therapies that weren't a vaccine. And it was a very strange time. And, you know, one of the tactics is called the Blitz. Another tactic of disinformation is called the Blitz. And that's where they harass scientists that are producing inconvenient science. And what I saw happen to us, I mean, myself, Paul, and Umberto, our careers ended. We lost jobs. You know, made up complaints were made up against Paul after 30 years, you know, working. You know, suddenly his employee file is full of nursing complaints, medical student complaints, you know, things that he said or did that were not true. And then he lost his privileges. And, you know, with me, they didn't like my public speaking and they tried to get me out. They finally fired me for a made up reason, but they didn't really need a reason. I was an independent contractor. They harassed Umberto Meduri. The federal government did, because he worked for the Veterans Administration. So that's a federal agency. And so he's literally working for the government. He has for 40 years. And his superiors harassed him and told him he had to retire. And so he went into retirement. He has a huge biobank of research samples because he did very high level research in critical illness and lung failure. And his research career and academic career ended. And so they don't play around. And the hit jobs in the media after us were cut, you know, and then the third party groups, Louis, you know, that pharma hires. There's a story coming out about these little groups on social media that they go and they're paid to literally attack, criticize, and ridicule serious physicians like myself. You get, you know, 20-year-olds, you know, getting paid by the hour so they can cause trouble on the internet. I mean, they'll use anything to destroy us. And what that is, when they attack me and my credibility, it's a form of censorship, because if they can't get me to shut up, they can get people to not listen to me by presenting me to the public as foolish or crazed or radical, right? Or unlearned. And that's the way they censor you, is by attacking your credibility. And it was really sad to see. I mean, reading about myself in the paper, like, I think nobody likes to read about themselves in the media, but like I was astonished of the way I was portrayed and described as a physician. I mean, it was hard to watch and read at first, but you get over it quickly.
Yeah, we have to go through that. We're supposed to be an anti-vax guru of a sectarian drift away from real science, and
Yep.
we are spreading disinformation and fake science. And some people 20 years old, having done no studies or so, are saying the truth and fact-checking what we're saying, which is kind of hard to bear sometimes. But it's part of this war, and you use the word war. It's really a war with casualties, with people dying about that.
Yes.
It's not only about information or virtual thing. People are real dying, as you said. Those people not treated by ivermectin, those people losing their job and not being able to cope with that and committing suicide for some of them. And so this is very violent and very harsh, and it's all about money and power and grabbing the control of a market, which is the market of the disease. And this market has been completely grabbed by the vaccination and the mRNA platforms now. And you can see as a doctor the consequence of that. Could you inform us a little bit about the patient that you see with post-vaccine injuries?
Yeah. So after, basically, like you, Louis, I was an ICU specialist, and it was clear to me after I lost my third job in COVID that I was not employable by the system. I mean, and so I was doing work for the FLCCC, but I missed doctoring, and so I opened a private practice. I do telehealth. I see patients in all 50 states, even across the world. I've had a French patient, but I have a number of Australians and New Zealanders. And, we treat long COVID and what I call long vax. It's the same disease, just two different triggers. In our practice, 70% of our patients are long vax. Their illness started after the vaccine. The other 30% had started after COVID. But although we call it long COVID, as if it's a new disease, it's not a new disease. I mean, it's literally the patients I see are suffering from what used to be called myalgic encephalitis / chronic fatigue syndrome, because all of my patients come to me with three cardinal symptoms. One is fatigue, post-exertional malaise, where when they try to do something, their fatigue gets a lot worse or their other symptoms get worse. And then what we call brain fog. So some cognitive issues, word finding, memory, focus, concentration, comprehension. But beyond those three symptoms, they have a whole side list of stuff. So the most common is dysautonomia. So high heart rates, low blood pressures, they sweat, they feel hot, they feel cold. They can't control the autonomic nervous system. Lots of sensory neuropathies. So burning, tingling, numbness, pain, sensations, electric shock-like feelings. And then cranial symptoms. So headaches, tinnitus, vision problems, and then obviously the rest of the body, musculoskeletal, gastrointestinal. I've never seen such a wide and diverse symptom burden. And the crazy thing is about ME/CFS, right, which is what we used to call this disease, because it's always been associated with infections, is that nothing works in everybody. And also the testing is generally normal. So you do imaging like CAT scans, MRIs, EKG, echo, lab work. You might find a little abnormalities, but there's nothing like that you can hang your hat on. And so most system doctors, they see this patient with 15 symptoms. They do all these tests. It's all normal. And then they say, you need to go to psychiatry. You need some counseling or therapy. And these patients are so physically unwell. It's a disaster. It's tragic to see, when they come to me and they tell me their story of their journey through the system, of being gaslit and abandoned and not treated and not understood and not heard. It shows you the really bad side of medicine, which has always existed, but particularly around the vaccines. When they bring up to the doctor that the vaccine did it to them, oh boy. It's a little different now than it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, doctors would get completely triggered and it turned into a bad visit. Whereas now I see a slow change and I'm hearing changes that doctors are now more sympathetic, but they don't know how to treat the disease. And the way in which I approach it is I do successive trials of therapy, because, what works in one patient will not work in the other, even though they present very similarly. It's such a difficult disease to treat. But I have kind of my favorite therapies, and I'll do a first line of treatment. Depending on how that works, I'll do second line, third line. And for some patients, I'm on my fifth try trying to help them. And even when one of my therapies works, it'll work with one of their symptoms in a modest way. And then I'll try something else. It'll work with another one of their symptoms in a modest way. So it's kind of like iterative, it's like putting Humpty Dumpty back together. And what's really weird is I was a minimalist in the ICU, and now my patients have lots of different pill burdens. They're taking these supplements and these medicines, and I try to stop anything that doesn't seem to help. But even with that, they end up taking quite a bit of medicine, and they're very hard to recover completely.
In France, we are trying to enhance the role of the potential role for spike protein and vaccinal spike protein. And so we're trying to find a way to dose this and to be able to show that people are still producing or not this vaccinal spike protein, and be able also to monitor in some way the efficiency of the treatment. But for the moment, we don't have the regulatory agreement to make those tests. So we're using D-dimer sometimes, something like that. But
well, let me talk about that, because I don't think you guys have the test, because I don't think the test is available in the UK either. But here we have this test called the semi-quantitative spike antibody dilution level. And so we're measuring the amount of spike antibody in the body. Now, that's not spike, but we think it's a proxy for spike. But what's so fascinating about the test, that's actually Paul Merrick, about this test, is the reference range goes from 0 to 25,000. And in our long COVID patients, they're in like the low hundreds to low thousands. So like 800, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. But the long vax patients are all through the range. And we have a cohort of patients where the spike antibody levels come back as greater than 25,000. And so you see these, what we think is representative of immense amount of spikes still being produced, right? So some of them haven't had COVID in many, many months, you know, and they're over 25,000. And so we use things that break down spike, things like nattokinase and bromelain. Others, EGCG is pretty good. And we follow the levels, and we do see that with interventions, those levels do come down, which generally correlates with symptoms, but not always. We do a lot of blood thinners too, because there's microclotting going on. There's so many mechanisms, pathophysiologic mechanisms, that it's really it's a challenge. But we're learning every day. We try every day to get better at what we do. But it's really, I mean, as you know, this was a bioweapon. This was a bioweapons accident, and a bioweapon was released. The vaccines were a countermeasure to this bioweapon. They were rushed out with barely any testing on a novel platform, which has turned out to be a toxic platform. The entire mRNA platform, I mean, there's misreading of the RNA. They're making strange proteins. The spike protein has a lot of homology with human tissues. There's a lot of autoimmunity. And then it's also, like you mentioned with D-dimer, I mean, it's very thrombogenic. I mean, we're seeing microclotting, macroclotting, and, you know, I sometimes look at my patients and they just appear poisoned. And I don't think that's an overstatement to say that they're poisoned.
Yeah, for sure. Plus, it enhances the amyloidogenic potential everywhere. And so we dealt with all this information during the Independent Scientific Council, but it's still an ongoing science. And it's very important that we should pledge for the development of the spikeology, of the mRNAology, trying to study that and to understand and to see what could be the treatment. Because for the moment, there's kind of a denial in the medical world around us. They kind of consider that it doesn't exist. And as you told us, they consider the patient to be lunatics, psychiatric patients, and give them antidepressants and anxiolytic molecules, which is worse than better.
Yeah.
And I think we can all state with the fact that there should be an immediate withdrawal of those mRNA platform and a moratorium for any development further. Would you agree with that?
100%, Louis. I can't agree more. I mean, you know, you also said something interesting, which is, you're right. We need a new field called spikeopathy. You know, we need to study the spike and all that it creates. It's the most pathogenic protein I've ever come across. And I'm going to give you an anecdote, which is a really shocking anecdote. But at the most recent holiday here, I was at a dinner, and I was at dinner with a pathologist, so a U.S. pathologist, and we were talking. And I said to him, we were talking medicine, and I said, are you guys staining for the spike protein? You know, I kind of thundered at him because I was so angry. And you know what he says to me, Louis? He says, what's the spike protein? Is that something to do with vaccination? He's like, I don't understand what all these people complaining about the vaccine. And then he went off on a rant about vaccines. But here's the thing. This is a pathologist, a very busy pathologist. He doesn't even know what the spike protein is. So if that was such a crude distillation of what's happening to science and the corruption around these therapeutics and these vaccines, they're censoring all of the data, so much so that a U.S. pathologist doesn't even know that it's a pathogen. And it's a really sad state. But I will say that the paper by Parry et al., Peter Parry, he wrote this massive 275 reference page on spikeopathy. It is brilliant. It goes through so much pathophysiology and science. And I think that's kind of a foundational text for what needs to be a new specialty. I agree with you.
Yeah, you're right. There is science now. Stephanie Seneff with Peter Maculo wrote about also amyloidogenic potential of spike protein, and that's very important. But as you mentioned it and the line that the doctors don't know nothing. They are in deep ignorance about those topics, and they are overwhelmed with the everyday life and the overwhelming tasks they already have to do. And so you are doing FLCCC, we are doing things in France with the Independent Scientific Council and all, but I can say that there's a big role for the public now to report those information, to spread them all over the network, and to go to the doctors and say, okay, can you read that? Can you tell me what it means? What is spike protein? And to go and needle them and try to make them think about the subject. All of them have doctors and relatives that can be connected to the healthcare world. And so maybe we can discuss with them all the time and trying to raise this topic and this subject. This will make the difference, because neither Pierre, neither I, neither Peter Maculo or anybody will make the difference alone.
No.
It's as you told, this is an information war where
Yes.
we don't have the weapons. The weapons are the social media, the censoring network surrounding the information, the general media having the power. So can we fight about that? We saw that we can manage sometime to drift an information through the teeth of the giant. And
Yes.
say,
Yes.
We manage sometimes to say something, and it's when we get in resonancy, when each of us say the same thing at the same time for 3 weeks, and we're hammering it all the time and all the time and all the time. So there's a big work to do about that, and for people who feel loneliness and not able to do anything, you can already do that. Like and put a thumb in the air for the video and copy it and send it to your relatives, and try to discuss with the people with kind of also patience, because patience and time are good ally in this. Now, as you mentioned, some doors are opening with doctors, with patients. We can discuss things we couldn't discuss 2 years ago, and so maybe things are moving forward a little bit progressively, and we should protect the people from another lunatic moment which may happen soon.
I agree. Thank you for that, Louis. And, I try to remember, I get defeated sometimes because it feels like there's no way to win this war, but I try to remind myself that it's about just saving maybe one person at a time. If you can get one person to understand what's really happening and the truth, then we've accomplished something. So I try to set my sights, just try to keep putting out the truth, because you're right. We all have to do it. Your call to action is beautiful, and let's keep fighting.
Yeah, I would like to underline one last thing. You told us about this plaint from Paul Maric and your friends about the FDA. What was the result? Because I think you didn't tell us what happened.
So let's finish there. So when the case was first brought to court, actually the case was dismissed by the judge because the FDA ruled that they had sovereign immunity, and which is actually true. You can't sue our government except for one situation. It's when they are overstepping their statutory authority. So when they do that, you can sue. But for whatever reason, the judge didn't understand that and dismissed it. They appealed, and the appeals court really criticized the FDA and said, you are practicing medicine, you have no authority to do so, and really reprimanded them harshly. And so the case was allowed to go forward. So the case was active, and a few months later, this is about a month and a half ago, the FDA reached out to the law firm and the plaintiffs and offered to settle. They didn't want to go through with this case, and so they settled. And what they had to do in the settlement was that they had to take down every single social media post, the horse tweet, everything that they've done against ivermectin. And there were dozens and dozens of tweets over the years through many, many different social media sites. And they also had to change their page on ivermectin on their website to not offer any guidance or on its use in treatment or prevention. So it was quite a humbling loss for them. And I think it showed the country and the world, like you've had me come on today to talk to you about it. I mean, people, noticed this case. And I think it's really important because it's literally a massive public health agency admitting that they had done something wrong. Now, they didn't say they did anything wrong because, they just settled. So obviously they weren't convicted of anything. And they still say that they haven't approved or authorized it for COVID-19. They're still doing that. But I think people know that you don't settle and take down all your posts if you didn't get it wrong. And so I think the question everyone should ask is, why did they do that? Why were they wrong? Why did they commit such wrong actions, which was so damaging, right? They literally got the world's to change their opinion on ivermectin, a safe, effective drug to a ridiculous horse dewormer. And they were responsible for that? Can you imagine such a world?
Yes, for sure. So it's kind of a small victory, but
Yes.
we have to grab that and to see that it's possible. Sometimes the judge and there is a settlement, and the judge unable it to move forward. And I heard in some of your tweets that you were realizing that the citizens and the patients should do out of the system now more and more, and should manage to shift by themselves and trying to grab them together and to help each other with the system being completely crazy and uniquely turned toward the profit and not the health.
Yep.
Is it your opinion about what's
Yeah, I
going
mean,
on?
I can't imagine. I mean, all I see is patients who are not being taken care of, not well served. I mean, the medical system is so controlled and captured. The doctors are not free to be a doctor. They don't have the autonomy to make decisions that are in the best interest of the patients. They can only make decisions that they're allowed to make, and only allowed to use certain therapies that are approved. And the same thing for media. I mean, I also say leave the media system. I mean, the media system is completely controlled. They can only say what they're allowed to say. And so you don't find truth or good medicine in those systems. And so I now work outside the system, and I have full autonomy and freedom to treat patients in any way that I think is in their interests. And that's another little discovery, Lewis, is I've learned so much about therapies and medicines that you would never learn about in the system, like hyperbaric oxygen and, the benefits of that, and methylene blue, and all sorts of different therapies that I use that, have insufficient evidence or don't have the big trials, but we've learned by observations, many effective therapies. And so I'm learning, it's almost like I'm learning medicine again, Lewis, because I'm learning all these different treatments and therapies that you would never be told about in academia or in the medical system. So that's another reason why I say, to get good care, you probably should go to someone outside the system.
Well, so maybe COVID is kind of an opportunity. It's a tragedy, but also an opportunity to make something new rise. And as you say, in France, people are organizing now to care for themselves, and they are learning again phytotherapy in the plants. They are learning about Chinese medical practice, which I didn't know nothing about. They are trying new things and really caring for metabolic medicine and what they eat, how they relate socially, and what's their emotion. And that is kind of beautiful also, because people are taking care of themselves and trying to get autonomous in healthcare, which is the 180 degrees away from what is proposed by the media, the government, and the pharma. So autonomy is a path to freedom, and this is important for the American people. All the time they are dealing with freedom, but we can say that they are kind of trying to put slavery everywhere. So maybe this could be an opportunity, and I would call people to organize by themselves. On your website, you are giving information about how to find healthcare providers, how to find ivermectin, how to use these protocols, how to organize. This is happening also in France, and everywhere people are organizing more and more. And my hope is that it would touch the institution, and the institution should change with that, trying this medicine out of the scope to reach our institutional system and to enable it to change, because it will not change by itself. It is ruled by the big pharma and now by big data industry. And you are propelled toward a transhumanist future with e-medicine and no more doctor, and you will have the Pfizer ordinance given to you automatically. And so this is not what should be wished by us. And so thank you very much, Pierre. Would you have a concluding word and say something to the French people listening to you?
I just want to say that, you know, when I was with you and I visited France, Louis, it was just remarkable to hear how identical our experiences were in two different countries. I mean, this is a global capture. This is a global dominance of our media and our medicine. And I think we've all suffered similarly. But I also think that we're fighting alongside each other in our own countries and trying to bring out the truth for the best interest of the patients. And so I appreciate you and what your organization has done. And I know the same goes back to us. And let's all, we're in this together. And you know, I just want to keep doing the right thing and trying to help people in a time of universal deceit. It's really sad. I never thought that in my life I would live through a historical period where I'm literally a resistance fighter. You know, I'm living in a time of complete propaganda and censorship, and we're literally in, you know, obviously not in a military war, but it is a war of information. And I think that's what you and I are trying to do, which we're fellow soldiers trying to bring out truth in a time when there's a lot of lies and suppression of the truth.
Yeah, and even in this very harsh time, it is possible to live happiness in everyday life and to care for each other in everyday life, especially for the people who do not believe what you think or disagree with you, because they are not your enemy. Your enemies are far untouchable and upper than that. So the everyday people that we meet are the people we have to reconciliate with, because as long as we reconciliate and we are together, totalitarianism cannot be entire and cannot be completed. So for me, it is more important to be with your stepbrother or half which you disagree with, but to have dinner with him and discuss about the beautiful things of life, and not about what separates us, but what brings us together. So
that's very wise. Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you.
Merci, Pierre, and say thank you also to Paul Marek and all your team.
I will.
It was a lifetime building a better world.
Thanks, Louis. Merci. Au revoir.
Bye-bye.